Let's get right into it. Good morning, everybody. It's Wednesday, February 2nd, 2022. Did you know Kanye West is releasing an album on February 22nd, 2022? Two.
Ooh, nice.
Dawn to part two. Pretty exciting.
I'm more impressed with the date than the album.
Well, if you know Kanye, you know it's going to be 7/2/22. It's going to be 5 months late.
Just like your typical software project.
Exactly.
Does he use Jira to manage his songs? Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you. Cool. So we got some stuff to talk about this week. Let's see. What did we talk about last? We talked about remix and we talked about promises and suspense. Mm-hmm. And that was a fun episode. Continued on with some promise suspense work at the end of the week. And ended up publishing that video so we can talk about that and talk about the next version of that, which is going to be getting it to update again. And a little insight about promises we picked up. And after the remix discussion, we looked a little bit more at it, and we're talking about like the data fetching on the client versus data fetching on the server, doing auth on the server and client. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that because it was kind of fun to like relitigate that whole thing and revisit the arguments for doing like data fetching and manipulation on the client side only, which is kind of like the next for sell way that they've been kind of recommending for a while. And we got some maybe other things that we can hit. So let's just start with the promise stuff. Basically, last week we had finished talking about using, once you kind of get adept with promises, you can use them to wrap third-party code into a promise, which you can then use to make an async function to suspend your app, which is pretty cool. So if you have something that's like an observable with a callback, it lets you now suspend on the initial version of that. So that was my YouTube video, and it worked really well. But it helped us simplify effects by moving the observer out. And that's nice because if you think about in the context of the video, we were doing authentication from the existing session in the browser. So the browser has some data that verifies the user signed in. You know, in a typical site, you have it in like a session cookie. Maybe that Firebase does it in like local storage. We don't really know. That's like a black box for us. But there's some data in the browser that contains a session, right? Mm-hmm. So when you do an effect within a React component, you get updates to that over time. So, use effect on all state changed. If you log out, throughout the lifetime of the application, all the components are going to re-render. When we moved this outside of the React component, which we did because it's kind of nice to do that. It's not really a side effect of rendering. If you think about the semantics of use effect, the intention there is that if you have a side effect of rendering, you put it in a use effect. Well, whether the browser is authenticated or not is not really a side effect of rendering. It's kind of like this global state that doesn't really depend on any particular component being rendered, right? So we pulled it out into module scope, set up the observer there, then create a bridge between module scope and a component using the promise.
Can we just add just to that, like why this isn't a good fit for effects? I think you can like hand wave and you can say like effects work well here, but I think the biggest thing for me is like when you're using Firebase, you might have some like dependencies to initialize your Firebase app, like the app ID and the domain. And like you could imagine those are changing. And the way that effects work is like your effects are going to rerun when data changes because they need to be in sync with like the data they're depending on. The Firebase like code, when you look at their docs, it's not made to like be rerun. It's like you just like paste it at the top of a file. When auth state changes, run this code. And so I think that's like even like the simpler version than based on re-rendering.
Yeah, right. It doesn't depend on rendering.
Doesn't depend on variables.
Right? Isn't that the same thing? It's like there's no variables, in it.
I mean, I've worked on like stuff where like the user could change and you need to fire some Firebase stuff, and like all of a sudden you have a dependency array on user to call some Firebase stuff, but it's like Yeah, I guess depending on rendering is fine.
Yeah.
I want to just try to simplify it, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's kind of thinking out loud. There's times when I set up Firebase in previous side projects and apps where the re-rendering part is actually causing problems. Maybe you're not cleaning it up, or it just makes it confusing. Why is this callback being changed again? It's kind of to your point. It's nice to be able to finally have a bridge that lets us just follow the docs, do it in a JavaScript file, as opposed to during a component's rendering. And so now that, one way to distill our entire discussion about this last week is to say, like, up until now, we've only had one way to trigger a re-render in React, and that's with set state. But now we have a second way, which is to resolve a promise. And because we don't have to get access to set state in any funky way using closure or anything like that, if we just throw a promise, we can resolve it. That means we can do any asynchronous work we need to and resolve the promise, and then React will trigger a re-render. So this kind of is a nice way to think about suspense, is giving us a bridge to the rendering life cycle from outside of a component.
Mm-hmm.
So once we did that, we lost the auto updating property of the previous version when it was set up in an effect.
Why?
Because we were using React State. That's really why. And so we didn't have it in React State anymore. We fetched the original current version user from a promise, resolve the promise, and then that triggers a re-render with that version of the user. And that's not going to change over time because promises don't change over time. So this led us to this kind of conversation, which is like, well, if you had a hook called like use session and it returns the current user, and that session can change over time, but at the beginning you want to integrate this with suspense, you want the initial call to use session to suspend your app because it's not ready yet. And you should delegate to the parent because that's the suspense way of doing things. But just because it should suspend initially and be a promise initially doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily change over time. So JavaScript promises don't really have this notion. They don't really have this. The semantics don't accommodate for this situation where there's a thenable that takes time until you have a resolved value, but then that resolved value changes over time as well.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of in my playing around in the video I'm going to work on this week is like, how do we tackle this? And, there's kind of the first approach where you basically create a hook, you use the promise to suspend initially, and then you use an effect to update it over time. This way, the consumer can suspend on initial render if they so choose, but they can also have access to current user, which is a live variable that updates throughout the life cycle. So that works pretty well, but then you're kind of like duplicating this code, and you're using an effect again. So, which is fine, but it's still back to some of the problems we already discussed. So in my own app, what I was nudged to pretty quickly is actually using one of the state solution libraries out there. And I think the original motivating factor for this was that I had my data library and I had my auth code, and I wanted my data request to read the token from the session so that all the requests that went out were authenticated. And just orchestrating that piece, now that I was doing auth setup in module scope, proved to be a little tricky, right? And so one of these things about these state libraries, things like Jotai, Valtio, and Zustan, which are all from this team called Poimanders. The words are crazy here, but they are different ways to do reactive state and create that bridge for you in a nice API, basically, without you having to do like React use state here. And so that you can continue to do this work outside of render, you can follow Firebase docs. You don't have to think about use effects, re-rendering when dependencies change, and all that jazz.
And you get your components will re-render when your state library changes.
Yes, exactly. So in the demo, that's kind of what I do. And I experimented with Valtio because I hadn't used it before, and I just wanted to try it. And it's more of a, imperative API? It's a more mutable API as opposed to like an immutable API. A lot of times the APIs that are in React and in the kind of related ecosystem give you functions like set state, set user, you pass in a value. Whereas this is more like you have a user and you do user.firstname equals some value. So you use like JavaScript assignment in order to do updates as opposed to like function calls, which is kind of fun. I mean, it's nice. It's easy. It's like what we're used to from Ember. It's how Ember did it. And it basically does it with proxies. It uses proxies under the hood so that they can like intercept an assignment and then trigger a re-render for you. But at a high level, they're all doing something similar and, creating this bridge for you to trigger re-renders in your React components. So it's pretty cool, actually, because while a promise can't change values over time, an object reference can, a key of an object reference. So when I set up Valtio for my session state, I have a property called current user, and it starts out as a promise. And Valtio also has something built in where if you try to access a promise in render, it will throw it. And that means it's going to suspend. So if you say in module scope, let session state equals new proxy state, current user is the promise, which is fetch initial session from my video last week. And then in the app component, you say use session, current user, question mark, current user display name, otherwise sign in. Your app's going to suspend just because you're accessing current users. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's really cool because the whole idea with suspense is if you come across a promise during render, you need to suspend. You're basically telling React this tree isn't ready yet, please suspend. And so it basically gets that mental model out into your state management library where if I'm accessing something that's a promise, it's almost like an invalid access. Like I can't access something that's a promise, and just automatically it's like suspended tree.
Yeah, totally. It's really cool. And it's cool that you are no longer manually throwing the promise, because really it's nice to understand how suspense works so that you get it. But from the domain of the programmer, that should be an implementation detail. And it's more like you want to tweak your mental model here that says like, I can access asynchronous things. It just means that the parent tree has to handle the time in between. And that's it. It caches the value, of course, like all these libraries do. And then session.currentUser is the promise. It resolves, which triggers a re-render. And then in the callback, not only do you resolve the initial promise, you actually set the current user to the response. So it's kind of like, it's a little weird in that as soon as the first time the callback is triggered, you resolve the promise and set the current user to now a JSON object instead of a promise. So if you just resolve the promise, the current user would return the right value, but you want it to update over time. So you just set current user each time. And that way, on subsequent fires of that callback, current user is going to be fresh. It won't be stale anymore. And but the dot resolve tells React it's ready to go again. And by the time I hit this line, I'll get the current user. And it ends up being a very elegant solution to the problem. You only have one spot in module scope where you set up on auth state changed. You're just updating the state value in a Valtio store, and then you just use it. And now it's like no implementation details. Anyone who needs a session will know that their component will suspend automatically when they use it. And this is really the way I think you should be thinking about suspense. If a component suspends, just rendering it should suspend. If a hook suspends, just using it should suspend. You shouldn't have to think about a separate step like, oh, I need to suspend here because I'm not ready. That should ideally be built into the component or built into the hook.
Yeah, that's a great point. As soon as if you try to use something and that something isn't ready, your whole tree should suspend. So this is like if you try to access a promise and the promise isn't ready, well, same logic, the whole tree should suspend.
Yeah, because when I was doing suspense early experiments with it, I'd be like, oh, wait, I want this to wait. So up here, I'm going to like throw a promise so that it suspends. But really, you want it tied to the thing you're using. It's the best way to do it. So yeah, it's pretty cool. And that's what's going to be my YouTube video this week. So I'm excited to get that one out.
Do you think, I guess, other than like the mutable API, are there any other differences between like Zustand and what's it called?
I used Zustand in my like fitness side project, and this one is Valtio, which is the proxy state.
So the promise thing is not built into Zustand, right?
Correct.
So Valtio gives you the promises as well as like the proxy mutable API.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep. And because it is proxy state, and it's working with like these objects that use like JavaScript assignment, you actually in your store, I was able to easily add a getter, which is something I wanted to do in my Zustan store to derive state from state in the store. So I have a similar auth hook set up in my fitness project. There's some middleware API that Zustan has. So I want the current user and like the auth token, which I use in my data request library. And then I want status to be unknown, authenticated, or unauthenticated. That's really derived from the value of current user. And there's no like really easy first party way to do that in Zustan. But in Valtio, you can just literally put right next to current user : undefined or whatever, or null, or just, I guess it's a promise. You can then do get space status is a function, and then you can return this. This references the state. So you can return like this dot current user is equal to the promise, then we know it's undefined, it's unknown. Or if this dot current user is null, we know it's unauthenticated. Or if this dot current user is not null, then it's authenticated. And so I love that, having the ability to use JavaScript getters right there to define derived state.
How does, if you have a component that's subscribed to status and status only, how does the library know that when the current user changes, the status should also change?
Not my problem.
No, but does
it works,
does
though.
it? Does
It's a
this
getter.
is like, but the Ember spent a lot of time engineering this, because the getter doesn't. If you have a thing that, if you have a library that's like subscribed to status,
they must know that you're accessing status.
Okay,
because it's a proxy object.
Okay,
so they must intercept like state session dot status and keep record of it and know that you have to re-render that component if status changes.
But
because
status
the store
only
is
changes.
updated. Well, it only changes if the store updates, but if the store updates, they know what's changed, so that they can notify anyone who's accessed a slice of the state. You know, like
I do. My spidey sense is going off here, but yes, I do know.
I hadn't thought about that. It works. I mean, I guess I could try it out where I don't access current user and see if it updates, but
or I think
it's
like,
part of the API.
My answer to this might be like, well, you just subscribe to the entire store, so like if current user
I
changes,
think part of their like features is like it only re-renders if that part of the state changes. You know, so like if I have use session and grab status off of it, and like first name of the user changes, I wouldn't get a re-render on that component.
So that's where the
you feel like you're having a hard time seeing how they would actually achieve that.
Yeah, well, and just knowing that like Ember does this, but Ember, like, this is like tons of engineering effort to get here, and like a deliberate design choice from Ember. That,
I mean, you put the object into a proxy function, so yeah. I was just guessing at a high level. Every time you access a property, they make a note of it somewhere. You know. Yeah.
Cool.
I don't know.
Cool.
Yeah. So, anyways, it's really cool. I think I might switch to it just for the fact that like the getters are really nice. I like that. I know it like uses this, and they're kind of like in the README. They're like, this is for advanced use. You know, it's like we like to stay away from this. I'm like, the API is nicer. I mean, getters
are
great.
Yeah.
It's fine if you could do it like status, and then it function takes in a state object. They have some derived utility that does that. It's not as nice to me. I like using the this in that case. And it's like, regardless, that's really a detail. You do that once. That's like an architecture level thing you set up in your hook, and then everywhere you use it, it's just property access. So it works just the same, which is sweet.
Cool.
I had started with, before I did the derived state on the store, I had the current user, and I was doing the derived state in the hook. It's nice that the hook, right now, the hook, in the version that I have right now that I think is going to be on my YouTube, the hook is basically a pass-through. The hook uses snapshot, points to the store, and returns it. And so it's not really doing anything. But it's still nice to have that point of abstraction there for use session instead of just obviously telling everyone to use snapshot, pass in session store.
Oh, absolutely. It's the same reason when you're using context, you just create a new one-line hook, like use auth,
exactly.
returns, use context, auth
Use context, auth context. Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And originally I did have the status in there in the hook because that's always going to be up to date every time it re-renders. So you could derive it right there as just a property and return it from the hook. But I liked having the status in the store because, again, in my real world use case, like another consumer needed the store outside of render. So they are able to import like the store, not the use auth, but the store and read from it. And so if they wanted the status, it just feels like it belongs on the store. It's like partly part of the store.
Also, too, like it just sucks. So you have to add a new thing to your store. And now you have to like go through a decision tree of, does this live in the store? Does this live in the hook?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yep. I like putting it in the store.
Cool.
But like if you wanted to set up an effect or something that looked and made a log, analytics log every time the user logged in or out, now you can just do that in the hook because you have a place to use effect, something like that, which actually is a side effect of render, right? Make a analytics log every time a signed in user visits a page or, signs in or whatever it is, right? So yeah, it's pretty cool. I like it. I like it a lot.
Nice.
Yeah. And it's not a lot of code. I was looking at NextAuth.
That's a good thing.
Yeah. I was looking at NextAuth a little bit and thinking it would be fun to try it on another project. But I like, even when we were back in the Rails days, we were doing like devise and stuff. I remember going through and doing like basic auth on my own to understand it. I think it's important, even if you end up using an abstraction library, to kind of get the pieces. And this is cool because this works kind of everywhere. If you just get a pattern you're comfortable with, it's not tied to Next, it's not tied to create React app or whatever. So.
Yeah, I think Firebase Auth is really good. It's like under the hood, it's like this Google Cloud identity thing, and they have just a bazillion different features. I think it's like really good for an auth system. And I've used like Cognito, which is amplifies auth, and I've used Auth0. And I found that just the Google one is just the Firebase one is just it's awesome. It's like awesome.
I was talking about NextAuth, the library, the abstraction library that would I would import use session from NextAuth and configure like a Firebase provider with it. I'm saying that's an alternative to like doing this yourself and like creating a store and setting up the auth and having it re-render because they like take care of all that. But there's something I like about understanding this. Even if you were to use the NextAuth library and use its use session and APIs, because it's just that's a complicated library. I think it's good, but this is nice. It's not part of Next or whatever, So
yeah, I mean the code you ended up with is like it's readable.
60 lines of code. Yeah,
I don't think you need abstraction there.
Right.
So yeah,
cool.
Nice.
What you been working on?
I was doing some file upload testing, which was really, really interesting because, first of all, in every app that I've worked on that's had file uploads, it's always been like not the point of the application. So, you're writing like accounting software, but you have the ability to like upload a profile picture. So like the file uploading isn't core to the software. And usually that means like, I just don't write tests. It's hard to test these things. When you do write tests, you end up mocking out the entire file upload thing. So, and the reality is you just end up testing a mock. And it's not core to the software. So if I'm going to spend time writing tests, it's going to be testing the accounting functions. But recently I've been working on this next S3 upload library that is all about uploading files from Next.js to S3. And it started off as like really simple, just like a little bridge between S3 and Next. But now, people have done some PRs, there's been some feature requests, and there's actually like a couple different ways to use this library. And every time someone did a PR, I would, testing file uploads is hard. So I would, I just run it in like a little demo app and make sure everything still worked. And you can see you can just hear this and just be like, that's so unsustainable.
Right.
So I decided to write tests for it. And the testing strategy that I landed on was I boot up a Next app that has this add-on installed. And then I use Cypress to go to a bunch of upload pages and and just use the library in, various different ways. So I'll have a page for just like basic example, and that's just like a basic upload. Then I'll have a page for like multi-file upload, and that's going to do, multiple file uploads. And how I went about testing it was I'm actually uploading the files to S3. So like when I push code to GitHub or when I run the test suite locally, I have some AWS keys and a secrets file, an EMV secrets file that is actually going to upload the files. So, part of this is like, there's like a bunch of trade-offs here. And I guess that's what I want to talk about. Part of it is like, you have to have an internet connection.
Right. You can't run it. It doesn't pass the plain test.
Yeah, it doesn't pass the plain test. Not only that, but like S3 has to be working. So if someone opens a PR when S3 is down, I mean, S3 does go down. It's not enough to make you not want to use it, but it does go down. So like your test suite has this like giant dependency. The other side of this trade-off coin though is that you are writing code that's uploading to S3. You actually want to make sure this works on S3 because it is so easy to misconfigure S3, to have an API key that expires, to have your IAM user go wrong, to have your bucket permissions go wrong, to have your course permissions go wrong. And so like the idea of like, oh, I'm just going to like mock this out. And it's just like, well, there's like a huge things that you don't know. And again, like in an app,
and you're writing a library where you give people instructions on how to do this. So you especially want to make sure it's like testing your docs work. It's and
exactly.
Now you can actually do it. You can grab the snippet of config from the docs, use that in the test almost, and run the test. And now it's like they actually work.
Yeah.
Which is super cool.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's great. And then there's also like there's some other things I had to decide. Like every time you run this test, like I'm uploading like some big files, like 2 megabyte files, and my multi uploads are doing like, a couple 2 megabyte files. Someone did a PR for like uploading like a 6 megabyte file because like there's like a limit where things get funky then. I don't think I want to write a test that uploads a 6 megabyte file, but I probably should. I mean, I realize I probably should because that's like, it was a regression that happened.
Right. I remember that happening with us in EmberMap.
Yeah. EmberMap was like 1 gigabyte.
Chunks.
You have to change from the post request to using the S3 SDK.
That's right.
I think maybe someone else found something at like 6 megabytes. You have to like enable a queue, or 6 gigabytes. You have to enable a queue. But anyway, they took the time to like write a PR and do all this. It'd be great if you could get the failing test, the code that gets it passing, and then the failing, the passing test.
That would be cool.
Yeah. So, I have GitHub running this. I have my computer running this. Potential contributors could be running this. And so your S3 bucket is just going to fill up with data. And you have to pay for that. I mean, you have to, even though it's only like a few photos, a few megabytes here and there. I mean, over time, that thing is just going to balloon, especially if you're doing like 6 gigabyte files. So, I found like a way in S3 to set up a rule that like just once a file is uploaded, delete it after a few hours. So like that made me feel better about like actually,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's like this S3 setup is like made for testing, and I'm the thing is, it's like the real question here is like what's going to make me feel confident that I can tell someone this library is working? Because when people used to open bugs, I would like run the code, and I wasn't confident, right? I'd have to run the code. So it's
that's awesome.
It's the first time I've ever have such a large dependency on an outside service of a test suite. And like even when we do Stripe, I use like Stripe mocking libraries because I trust that those libraries have good parity with Stripe.
That's very cool. No, I mean, like back to like what we usually think about with testing is like, oh, you can't run on an airplane. That therefore it's like a bad test. But the point of tests is to give you confidence. I mean, that's like the biggest value for us.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to be confident this works until you have an internet and try to upload it to S3. Now, you could say the same thing about using Hasura. You're not going to have confidence it works until you connect to it. But the reality is there's so little to do on the Hasura side once you set it up. Their points of failure are so much less. Hasura is down. The more common areas where your code fails is the stuff you're writing in your app to do GraphQL requests and work on the data. So that's why our tests for that kind of thing live there, and even for Stripe live there. But here, it's like there's enough complexity and steps involved that you want to make sure those steps are working in the Amazon side. So I like that a lot.
Yeah. Brought up some interesting things like I have a thing that exposes file progress as you're uploading it. And so if I'm thinking about like how I would test this is that if it was like mocked out, I would do something where like I start the upload, I increment, like I manually in my test increment the progress to 10%. I do some assertion that like the UI actually has like a progress indicator that's like 10% of the way full. And like, and then maybe increment it to like 50 and then 100. But now that I'm directly uploading to S3, I don't have, like, they don't give you like a way to control the upload and to pause it. I mean, maybe there's like some like really hacky way you can reach into the library and do that. But like, I don't have.
There's some of the aspects, because it's a service you don't control. There's boundaries you have to move farther forward.
Yeah. Also, like errors, like I can't like just mock out that S3 is down. Right. So I can't say like, how does my library behave when S3 is down? The only way to know that is to run the test suite when S3 is down. Right. So there are some things you lose with mocking. The way I do the file progress is I just upload a file and then I basically wait for the progress indicator to hit 100%. And that's how I know that like the file progress is being reported correctly. Yeah. And so like think about it, if it like was stuck at 0 but the upload worked, my test would fail, and I know there's code I have to investigate, but I don't know that it's like going from like 10 to 50 to 100. So definitely some stuff you lose when you're no longer mocking.
Yep, that's cool. Your video last week was cool too. I mean, we spent time on it together, and part of this like high level end-to-end test was you wanting to verify the image you uploaded ended up on the browser rendered, and there were some race conditions we worked through. You worked through in the video, we were working through in prep, where you can have the image pull down, but the browser hasn't downloaded it yet. So if it's broken, that's a bummer. And that's like if you're you have a deny policy on your get object method of your bucket. So you can upload just fine, but you want to make sure you can see it. And so that's a nice little test as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are the tests that basically that video was extracted from all this testing work.
Right.
And these are the tests that I'm doing. It's like, okay, make sure the upload works, make sure like you get like, all those things return what they should return, but then also make sure that like the file you upload, if it's an image, it's renderable in an image tag. Because I have instructions in the README about how to do all this, and it's just so easy to fat finger AWS instructions. So knowing that I have a bucket that was set up following the instructions, and then I have a whole test suite that's doing all sorts of different uploads against it. It's just, confidence, right?
That's good.
Confidence.
Yeah, it was interesting.
When someone opens an issue and they say it doesn't work, and I'm like, oh man, but like I know deep down inside, I know it's your AWS config. Like I just know you did something wrong, but I just want the confidence to,
That's good. One of the interesting things that came out of your video is like, how do you assert that the image is viewable in the browser? And you start by saying like .visible is true, image MDN like object JavaScript object in the DOM has like a complete property which can be true, but you kind of land on this approach that's like the best proxy is like checking the width and height, the natural width and height of the image element, comparing that with the original source image.
Yeah, this part was super interesting. So exactly what you said, like how do you know that the image is rendered? You have a natural height and a natural width that are both greater than 0, right? So you know that like there is something drawn on the screen. You would think like, one of my initial approaches here was like, I know the image I'm uploading, it's like on disk and I can read its contents. And so why can't I just get the contents of an image file and I can compare them, and then I can be like, it's a perfect match.
It's literally a base 64 encoded string. That's where I was going. Like, this part.
Yeah, so I could like do a perfect match to make sure the image I upload is the image that's displayed. But it turns out the browser security model prevents you from doing this. So like
Yeah.
when I'm uploading the image, I'm running like a Next app on localhost 3000 and I'm uploading it to S3. And then I take the URL that it was uploaded to on S3 and I render that inside of an image tag. So the image tag has an S3 URL and my browser is running JavaScript on localhost 3000. And so you can't, the security policy of the browser is like you can't read the data of images that come from other domains because you could leak data in there. So like
So let's see an example, right? You have localhost, and then you render an image tag with source facebook.com/my or onlyfans.com/user123,
or just like myprofile.png. And so like or just
OnlyFans, right?
Yeah.
Your browser is logged into OnlyFans or for somebody, and I can write a web app that renders an image tag pointing to that origin. And if your browser renders my web page, it renders that image tag, which points to an other origin. Well, you as the user have access to that because if you were to visit that image in a separate tab, you're logged in, you have access to it. So we were like, at least I was like, how is this a security thing? Because the user has access to that image. Why couldn't you get the content from your code? But the answer is that you could write JavaScript that fetches that image from another origin, base64 encodes it, and then uploads it to your server through an AJAX request.
Yeah, or just not even fetches it, just reads the data out of an image tag and then uploads it to a server. So like my server can all of a sudden see all the pixels on your screen.
Right. It was weird. It's a weird thing to think about because like you think it's basically like image tags are sandboxed or something like that. It's like you have access to this data, but like, you can't. Like, could you do that with something else? Like, yeah, I guess that's a good question. Like, if I had an iframe that pointed to like bankofamerica.com/account and you're logged in, would it load? I guess it would, but you can't access it with JavaScript.
Correct.
And it shows your bank account.
Correct. There's also HTTP headers that say when Bank of America responds, says this content is unloadable in an iframe because the only people that want to load this in an iframe are people doing malicious things.
Right.
So it's like whatever iframe.
Is this like cross-site origin requests? Basically, this is
it actually.
I've known about cores for years, but like this is a nice concrete example.
Yes, this is a subset of cores, and in fact, in your image tags, you can say cross-origin anonymous, which will, I believe,
not use the sensitive data your browser contains to potentially access privileged information.
Right, to request the image, and then now the JavaScript can read data about that image because you've marked it as an anonymous image. Now, in order for that to take place, the server that image is hosted on has to reply with a header that says it's a course header that says anonymous access is okay. So you don't just want to turn that on.
Especially if you're allowing user uploads because you start uploading sensitive things.
Yeah. It's interesting
it is interesting because when you start thinking about it, you don't think that there's a security vector here, a risk vector.
It's like this is all client-side code and the client has access to it.
Exactly.
So who cares?
Exactly.
Like,
the user is authenticated.
The code can communicate back to a server.
Exactly. It's like the code can do things that the user is not intending to do. And so the policy is such that the user is reading this data themselves with their eyes, and that's like the only thing we are allowing. So we can't allow arbitrary code to do whatever we want with this. Post it to Instagram or something like that.
There's some like other interesting like versions of this exploit over the years. So like one was imagine Gmail has a JavaScript endpoint, that API endpoint, say JavaScript endpoint, where you can download like an array of all the user's email messages. And so I can like throw that on my page and I can actually overwrite the array constructor. So when my page starts reading in that JavaScript, Like I can like steal all your
Oh.
messages. I think I might be missing some details in the story, but like
Mhm.
there's one that's like you shouldn't respond with arrays because yeah, there's other websites that can like
I
override the
see.
array constructor. And yeah, there's just all sorts of versions of these things, and you only learn about them when you think like, oh, I'll just compare the image contents, and nope.
Yeah. That's interesting.
So anyway, the test, the best version of the test is I take the image that I uploaded, because this is a Cypress app and I have a fixtures folder, and I take the image that I then downloaded from S3 and I make sure they have the same height and width. And that's the best
proxy
way,
for these two images are equivalent that you
yeah,
can do.
Exactly. And then also too, by the way, if the images are on the same server, you can read contents.
Right.
So it's really it's a cross origin thing. So if they're coming from the same
right.
server,
Right.
it figures, well, the server already has the JavaScript page already has access to it because it's on the same server. So
Right. So if you use like a proxy or something, you could fetch the image from localhost, and then that fetches it from S3. Then you could download it or whatever.
Yep.
Compare it. It is interesting. Yeah, it makes sense. The browser downloads the image, but the code doesn't have access to it, and you can't get access to it, even though it's like literally there.
Yeah. It's there's a lot that comes up a lot when people are trying to like you imagine you're making an image editor in the browser, and you take an image and you load it in a canvas, and then you apply a bunch of effects to it. You actually can't do that because if it's in canvas, you can now read its contents. So when you try to do this, I think it renders like 0 pixels or it throws an error. But yeah, it's
interesting. I think I ran into that when I was doing that and trying to add the use gesture stuff to that. And I tried Canvas for a little bit. Pretty cool. No, you ended up with a really good test suite, and like that feels like something we'll be able to carry to future projects, you know. And like the select file API from some add-on you used with that was good.
Yeah, Cypress doesn't have like how do you add a file to a file input, but there's a plugin with, if you Google how do you upload files in Cypress, it's every answer points to this plugin.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, good stuff.
Awesome, man. All right, shall we wrap it for this week?
Yeah, sure.
We got some projects maybe on the horizon that'll be fun to talk about soon. It's a little early now, but we're getting excited for the work we're doing this year. So I'm excited. We've been back on the mics and on the podcast regularly. We've been making videos on YouTube, and we're basically like really focused on educational material this year, and don't know what form that's going to take quite yet, but it's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Why don't we end with a link here from the Cursed Computer Iceberg meme? We could just start doing this at the end of each show.
You know, last week I was like, I'm going to read a story every night and like, you know, just like
and you forgot about
better
it.
myself. I've literally read 0 since last week, but I'm happy.
But this is a good little trigger. I'll pick one. If you can pick one by the time we're done, we'll share yours too. Mine is SVG supports JavaScript. This is below the water.
I'm gonna do. I love this one. I'm gonna do a sleep sort. So it's it's above the iceberg. It's a great one, but it's an O1 sorting algorithm.
So yeah, this one is just SVG script element allows to add scripts to an SVG document. So script tag, it's like a tag within a tag kind of thing. It's kind of fun. Who would know? Scalable vector graphics includes a Turing-complete programming language. Kind of weird. Seems appropriate. All right, what's yours?
Sleep sort.
Sleep sort?
Yeah, sleep sort. It's an O1 sorting algorithm.
Can you explain it for the audience here and for me?
So a lot of times when you're sorting, you have to I think like the fastest sorting algorithms are like n log n. So that's like quick sort and merge sort, and they have trade-offs in like their best case and worst case and memory allocation and all this stuff. But you can never just loop over an array once and have it sorted.
Right.
You can never just do that.
You need some memory or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I guess you could loop over it and like you start copying them into a new array. But like, there's memory trade-offs, there's step trade-offs, and like O log n is like just the fastest realistic sorting algorithm. So sleep sort is
it like the slowest?
No, it's NON1.
It's a real algorithm,
or it's O1.
Oh,
It's
okay.
O1. It only
Okay.
takes one pass of the array. It's super slow, but the way it works is you loop over the array, and it's an array of numbers or whatever. You just be able to assign a number value to every item in the array. So let's just say it's an array of numbers. You loop over, and the first number is the number 7, and you do set timeout console.log 7, and the timeout is going to be 7. And then the next number in the array is 3.
And so you push them in order.
You push them in order, but they all have different
taking
timeouts.
longer for the later in the sort order
Yeah.
it is. So you push the slowest one, the fastest one first, and it ends up sorted correctly.
You're basically using.
Oh my gosh! That's
you're basically
hysterical.
using like JavaScript's run loop stack as a method for doing the sorting. So you're just pushing on to different stacks, and then you just wait. And then your console logs are literally all going to be in order because like the 3 had a timeout of 3 and the 7 had a timeout of 7. So the 3 gets logged before.
That's absolutely brilliant.
Sleep sort. It is beautiful.
Sleep sort. That is the content I'm here for. That is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine pulling that one out on a Google coding interview. You know?
I mean, you know,
it's not practical, right? It's O of 1 though. It's O of 1. Yeah. I mean, you could do set timeout and do the number divided by 1,000,000 or something. Make it a little faster.
It's actually like just like God to get nerd sniped by this. Oh man, here we are.
It's brilliant.
It's like O1 from like your point of view because you're only iterating over the array twice, but then you're like you're actually like inserting. There's like a JavaScript run loop stack. And you're inserting it based off the timeout. So there's some code that's like inserting it into a run loop.
It's running.
queue,
it's actually not.
and it's actually doing the sorting. Because if you have like a 7 and a 10 in the queue, and then I insert a set timeout with like 8,
it needs to know to execute that one first or whatever.
Yeah, where does that one go?
Yeah,
But from our point of view,
oh my gosh, right from the perspective of the caller, it's oh my gosh, that's hilarious. All right, cool. Well, a little bit of programming trivia there to end the episode. If you made it this far, I don't know what's wrong with you, but we love and appreciate you. So we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.